Here we are. Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is Saturday, December 16th, 2023 at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Welcome, everybody.
Woo.
Good morning, Randall and Danny. How are you guys? How's your
I'm doing
coding
well,
this
man.
week? Good, good. Everybody good?
Yeah, this week Sorry, has what'd been you a lot say? I of missed the fun.
Nice. Awesome. All right, let's just talk on top of each other all
All right,
day.
go ahead.
I'm joking. Well, yeah, welcome everybody who's tuning in live. Hopefully you guys are watching in the group. We had a couple people who said they would be here. It looks like there's a couple people tuning in already. So, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in again. And Randall, why don't you do your reminder at the beginning of our live stream for everybody to
Well, for anybody who's watching right now, let us know down in the comments. I mean, what have you been going through this week? What are you working on? What projects have got you involved? And what problems, obstacles are you up against?
yeah, that's a good one. And it's really the topic of today's video is feeling frustrated and stagnated while you're learning to program. And I know I've felt this a lot before. And have you guys felt that before?
Yeah, learning anything, man. I think, we
Yeah.
all feel that way, right? I always feel like, when you start something, there's like that excitement at the beginning where everything's new and you feel like you're making a lot of progress because you're like, yeah, I know this, I know this, I know that, and then but you hit that certain point where it gets hard and then it just feels like you don't know anything. Because the more you
Yeah,
know, the more you realize you don't know, right? And the more questions you have about it. So it's like, yeah.
totally. And I want to give a big hello, Chris, because he said, "Hey guys" in the chat. So hello, Chris. Welcome. Good morning. Thanks for tuning in again. Yeah, I mean, you're always gonna find some time of being frustrated and stagnated. I know that I have felt, particularly with like self teaching, right? Because you don't have anyone else there. It's just you versus whatever you're trying to learn. And I felt that because I've done like a lot of self teaching. Like I did Code Academy, I've done LinkedIn Learning, I've done a million and one YouTube tutorials. And even inside a boot camp, like a lot of that is self teaching, right? You have an instructor per se, but it's not like somebody that's like working with you and there on a regular basis. They're just like, hey, here's your coursework this week. And I mean, even from our experience, we had a lot of um, in our boot camp. I remember we had like a weekly sort of call, but you would go there and the instructor knew like almost not any of what they were teaching us.
Yeah.
Um, so it can be frustrating, not knowing sort of where to go, how to overcome these obstacles. So my question is, have you guys felt that one? And what have you done to sort of overcome that? Like, what has been how do you get motivated again? How do you get rid of that frustration? I'll let you go
So,
first, Randall.
yeah, so I mean, I've definitely experienced this, and it's something that comes up over and over again. Like, I don't think it's something that you just solve forever. It happens one time,
Mhm.
you solve it, and then you're good. But like,
Yeah.
I do notice that there is kind of a disconnect where like you learn all of this stuff, all like the basics in the book. Like, you learn how to do loops and you learn how to do conditional statements, and then you're like, okay, great. I know variables, I know arrays, I know loops, I know conditional statements, but then you look at these like complex projects and you're like, well, where's the middle ground? How do I bridge
Yeah.
this gap?
How does that
And so,
apply? Yeah.
yeah, and it's a challenging position because that's exactly where most people will quit. Because
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and then and here's what I've done from my own experience. I'll change programming languages. I'll be like, oh, clearly it wasn't that language. I'll have to learn this other language. So I'll go through the
Yeah.
same thing. I'll learn variables. I'll learn arrays. I'll learn conditional statement. All this stuff. I'll get there, and then same thing happens. And it's like bridging that gap that's the hardest part.
Yeah,
And
that's a
what's
great point.
funny? I'm glad you mentioned that too, because it made me remember I can't tell you how many times in learning different languages or frameworks where I'd hit that point, I'd go online and do I'd be like, oh, okay, here's a cool tutorial on this project. That'll help because that's where I'm having this issue is like the whole project. And then you find out that it's just like a freaking thing from their documentation, some
Yeah.
stupid short project that doesn't answer any of those questions and where you don't have any real problems. And I think I always found for me that's the big thing is like having real problems to solve pushes me forward. And
Yeah.
forces me to confront these issues and also learn how to overcome them, you know? And I think
Yeah.
so like that's always been a big help for me is like having actual real projects and finding things that are like even tutorials and learning material that actually give you like a real introduction to something where it's actually complicated and complex, not like tic-tac-toe or like Hello World BS, you know, you
Yeah.
have to do for everything.
That makes me think too, like I've been in many situations where I go for, okay, so you have these sort of tutorial style projects where it's real simple, right? Like what you're saying, like tic-tac-toe. And then the next extreme is you're like, oh, let's follow this React tutorial on YouTube or something. And there's so much assumed information that you understand. I remember when we first started learning React, I was like super confused about the folder structure of a React project. Like, what are all these things? What is like package.json? What are all these like different parts that are just thrown in there? And then when people talk about a React project, they just assume you know what all that is and how it
Yeah.
functions. Even like node modules, for the longest time, I had no clue what node modules were, and nobody just explained it because they just assume that you know that, and that can be so frustrating and like lead you to that stagnation where you're just, you don't know what you're doing and how the pieces connect, and so you're sort of like, okay, I guess I just stop here. And so my question to you guys is, how did you overcome that? What, how would you recommend that over other people overcome that?
I mean, I think, oh, good.
Go ahead, Randall.
Go for it,
Oh,
Danny. Okay,
no.
fine. So, what one thing that I did was, I looked at like schools because schools are so good at selling what they have. Why? Because there's an end goal that you think you'll get, and they have the whole structure all the way there made for you. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people love schools is because they can just be like, well, I want to be this, so I'll just throw way too much money at this organization that's not going back into my education. And then they'll have coursework for me for 4 years or 8 years or however long it is. And at the end, I'll be that. So I kind of took the same thing in terms of what I wanted to do. Like I knew the direction. I mean, I'm not where I want to be, but I'm on track in the direction. And what I did that was helpful for me was actually like figuring out right now where my end goal is, and
Mm,
then breaking that down into, well, what things do I actually need to be able to do in order to get there, and start just accomplishing those. And I have some other suggestions too, but I think that's kind of like a very useful one because
yeah.
that takes where you want to be and where you are, and it kind of tracks the course. And then you can always say, well, am I on course or am I off
Yeah.
course? And
That
you
makes a
can,
lot of sense. I get a lot of questions from people regarding, they have this vision of, I want to be a full stack. Like this was actually asked me privately this week. I had somebody who reached out and said, I want to be a full stack developer. I've learned I've learned HTML and CSS, but I have no clue where to really go from here. Do I start with JavaScript and then what else do I have to learn? And I went through basically everything after that, like JavaScript framework, learning databases, APIs. And I
It's a lot. Yeah.
very end, I said to him, yeah, I said exactly that. I know that sounds like a ton, but you just start with one piece and you start chipping it away, because what happens is, and this frustrated me too when I was in boot camp. I wanted to understand how all the pieces fit together, but you can't in the beginning. You have to just go piece by piece. And then as you learn more, it all starts to connect. Right. And so that's what I said to him is, you learn JavaScript, you learn the databases, you learn the APIs, you learn the backend code. And then once you start working with all that stuff, it becomes significantly easier because it all just connects right to each other and it makes sense. Go ahead,
That's
Dan.
how I've always thought of learning too. Like even in college and stuff, no matter what you're learning, once you start to see connections between like what you're doing and other things in that area, that's when you're really learning things. Because that's when
Yeah.
you're starting to see like the broad picture. But also to the point of like, when you get stuck too, I've always found too like you were talking about the file structure, like that used to frustrate the hell out of me because
Yeah.
nobody seemed to explain it. And like also finding somebody that had like if you find the right explanation for something, it makes it so much easier because it'll just click. So finding somebody who can explain it to you can be super helpful too. I mean, it could be like
Absolutely.
a friend you're working with, could be a mentor or whatever, but that can be a really helpful way to kind of bridge that gap too and get to that next level. Also, I would just say too, recognize that things take time. It's gonna take time. Like I know like we all want to rush it. Like I know when I started, I was like, I want to be a coder now, right
Yeah.
now. you know, and it's like, but it's going to take time. But you do see that progress, you know. We did have a question too in the group.
Yeah.
Rachel asked, like, if we have any advice on how to get through programming books or documentation. She says she's struggling with Shay Howells. I don't know that one. Learn to code with HTML. It's so simple and boring.
Okay, I have an answer for that, but first I want to touch on what you were saying, Danny, about it takes time. So like no video on YouTube will get clicks if it says how to be a developer in 10 plus years. You know, it's the one where like it's the video where it's like I got hired by Google after learning to code for not, you know, like 6
I
months or
learned
something like
Python in
that.
3 days, and then
Yeah,
Google called me and hired me.
They
exactly.
sought me out.
Yeah.
But it's just not realistic because I mean, maybe for some exceptional people, but everybody's different in terms of learning. And I've had it told to me that you can choose what you want to learn, or you can choose the time frame that you want to learn it in, but you can't choose both at the same time. So like if you
Yeah.
want to learn full stack, well, you just start learning it, and it's going to take however long it takes. Or if you're going to learn for 3 months, well, you can learn for 3 months, but good luck knowing what you'll actually learn.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then coming back to how to get through like technical books. So, first off, if a book doesn't speak to you, get rid of
Yeah.
it. There's a million different
Yeah.
resources out there. So if something just doesn't speak to you, get rid of it. But also, this is something that I used to get stuck on all the time, because I'd buy these technical books and I'd get through some of it, and then I would get stuck and I would get really pissed off thinking I'm stupid, what's wrong? And I kind of like gave up trying to understand all of the book. I aim for understanding maybe like 50 to 80% of a book. And if I can do that, I just go through it, and then I can always come back again and again. So those are my
Yeah, that's a good
focus
point.
on the books.
I would say too, with working through books, because I actually like working through books. I do work through, like, I like books a lot, so I'll go through books a lot with technical books and stuff. But like, I've always found too, like you said, once not speaking to you, find another one that's adjacent to it. There's like,
Mhm.
I mean, learning HTML and CSS, for example. I know there's like learning web development covers HTML, CSS, JavaScript. It's a similar type of book. I enjoyed that one, but find one that's like adjacent to it and then go through both simultaneously. That's helpful. I'd also recommend, like, even if it's boring, do the code, like actually
Yeah.
type out all of it instead of, like, you know, if they have online resources, try to refrain from copying and pasting as much as you can and try to type it out, because that's actually how you learn. I mean, just doing it is what makes you remember how to do these things, to solve these problems, and to like anticipate those things coming up when they do.
Yeah. I have two additional recommendations for Rachel. Number one is know your learning style, because I know Randall and Danny are huge book learners and I am not. Like, I do read books, but yeah. But I much prefer video tutorials, right? So I spend a lot of time on YouTube, LinkedIn Learning, that kind of stuff, so that you do what works best for you. Books don't have to be the only way. That's my one suggestion. The other one is, and this is something that I did for years in my life, is I always thought you had to read a book from the front to the back. That's just like how it's done. And you don't have to do that. You can just read the parts that are important to you. You can skip around. It's your book. You own it. You can do whatever you want with that book, right? You can throw it in the trash if you want to, but you don't have to go from, page to page. If there's a part where you're stuck on, just move past it and something will click for you and bring you back to that. So those
Can
are
I
my
point
two suggestions. Yeah, go
real
ahead.
quick, because you just remind me of something too. That's another thing I like doing that does work well, is start a simple project like on
Mhm.
your own, and then use the book as a tool to do that project.
Yeah.
So like, for instance, like, you know, I remember when I was trying to do just learn basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, I got that one learning web development book, and I just started a portfolio website that I started writing myself. It was not good. This was really early on my develop, in my learning, but I started on my own, and then I would just go through the book and try and find out, okay, so what do I need to do here? And like that way I was doing something else while I was like kind of using the book just as a means to complete that project, which was helpful because it makes the book a different type of thing in that case, instead of just trying to go through, like you said, cover to cover, which is not always best for everybody.
Yeah. And to add to that point is do a project that you're passionate about. Something that is like, hey, this would be cool if I could figure out how to do this thing. And it may be something that seems overly complex at first, but that's okay, because having that passion built into it will drive you forward, right? Because books can be super dry. I find that books are very dry. And sometimes I find books where I love the book and I can't stop reading it. But for me, for the most part, I have no interest in reading most coding books. However, I do have some really good ones that I like and I go back to. So it's sort of just, I think, a give and take of understanding what works best for you and then just getting the parts out of it that apply to what you're doing. And then use that passion. Yeah. Go ahead, Randall.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so here's another thing that was interesting. I was listening to this book, Think Again, and it was talking about imposter syndrome, and I found this very appropriate because, like there's basically a spectrum between imposter syndrome and overconfident, and everybody falls in there somewhere. But they did a study with doctors and then also another profession I forgot, where actually the people with imposter syndrome were the ones who ended up being the better doctors, learning more in the time period. Because they were trying to do the best that they could. And so this is something that comes up a lot in the coding, the imposter syndrome, because you get to a point where you learn the basics, okay? And then you're like, yeah, but I just know the basics. Well, there's really not that much difference from you and somebody else, especially now with tools like ChatGPT, everything else out there, like being able to just search stuff on Google, there's not that much of a difference. So starting to give yourself a little bit of confidence, being like, yeah, I'm a total noob. I may only know this much stuff, but let's see what I can do.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think also, yeah, I was going to say too, I think, no, I really like that point too. I think too, like when you're looking at any kind of thing that you're trying to learn too, it is helpful. I know we already mentioned this, but get an overview picture too of how things works. I think this is where books can be actually very beneficial, is like just getting like a high level look at like, okay, if I'm going to do web development, well, what is the interaction between CSS, HTML, and JavaScript? Why the hell do I need CSS and JavaScript? What do they do? How does this relate to the back end? If I'm trying to do this, is it a front end thing or back end thing? Like knowing that can really help you to understand like what's happening in the actual book and in the what you're trying to learn in general.
Yeah. I see a comment here from Eric Sanchez saying any recommendations, and I think he's speaking of book recommendations. So Eric, if you have specific things that you're learning, we can throw some book titles in there for you. I know Rachel was talking about HTML, and I have a book. I forget the name of it now. It's actually done.
I would say I do. While you're looking for, I would say learning web development's pretty good. It's an O'Reilly.
This is like a great.
Duckett. He does good ones. Yeah.
This is just great. Like, this is a great book that you don't have to read cover to cover. You can just, and it's very visual too. It's not just pure text, because that's hard for me too when it's just all text and no visual. That was a great book. But anybody here, if you guys have questions about specific topics, just throw it in the chat and we will be happy to throw some book recommendations in there. I'm sure Danny and Randy have a million of them too. And Danny also, I think you have a nice PDF library of some books. So
I do.
You can share some of those too.
I have about
like
about 100.
Yeah, like collecting the PDFs, which is great too because you can read them on your computer.
I also like the PDF version too because you can do Control F. So like when I am trying to solve a problem, if I'm looking if sometimes documentation depends on it. There's documentation that's awesome. Like we were talking about this the other day. Like we're Next.js, for instance, is pretty good.
Yeah.
I find like Tailwind and Bootstrap have pretty good documentation. But then there's other ones where it is like React Router is garbage. we were talking about there's some documentation that is just unhelpful. Like they assume way too much, and for a new person, you just can't get through it. Like I'd say about
how do you deal with that? How do you actually handle that?
I mean, I've ran into that problem a lot, and especially where documentation I find a lot of times deals with simple cases but not complex cases. So now my go-to is it used to be before, I use ChatGPT a lot now to help me in those situations. Mm-hmm. But I also use books a lot. I'll find books that are I don't know if you guys are familiar with the cookbook. There's a lot of cookbooks that out there that will show you how to do certain things with JavaScript or Python or whatever. And those can be useful, but you have to know the problem you're trying to solve. You have to understand enough to be able to actually access that information and apply it. That's the only hard part.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, for me, what I tend to do is, for example, with React Router DOM, because I don't know if everybody here knows React, but it's basically how you handle routing between pages. And the documentation is pretty horrible. It just assumes a lot, like Danny said. It's not highly detailed, and it's very complex what they give you, and they don't explain a lot. So what I've done in the past is really two things. One is I just use YouTube tutorials, find somebody who's building a React project with multiple pages and see how they build it, like their structure. And then the other thing is when I find a way that works really well for me, I just reference that code. Like it's okay to copy and paste your own code whenever you want. So you just open an old project that you had where it worked and then reference your own code. And then of course, ChatGPT is a great tool that we have at our disposal now, which is really nice for junior developers because for the most part, it can answer a lot of questions. With newer technologies, it may not be as great, but things like React Router DOM, I mean, even that they updated the whole way that that works fairly recently. So you can get mixed answers, but you can at least get yourself there. And then what I recommend too is prompting it to explain what's going on because that's super helpful too.
Yeah.
Or just put in your code and say, explain why this is not working in the way that I want and explain, right, this is how I want it to work. Why is it not doing this? Usually you get some pretty good answers from that.
Also, too, I think like finding community and people you like that you can, work with as mentors is great too, because like I know that helped me
Yeah.
so much. Like we work together, I mean,
Yeah.
we still do, but every week. And like just having, because you guys have different interests too. So like sometimes you would see things a certain way that I maybe didn't see. And then like the way you would explain it would just click, because that happens. Sometimes you just need a different perspective on it or someone who's not stuck in that problem, you know?
Yeah.
I do
Yeah.
want to say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a great point is having a peer group like what we have in this group and mentors like what we can be for you guys will really help you get further faster because there are going to be times when you just feel stagnated. And this is why we have this group, right? I have many people who've reached out who are like, I don't know the next step. And it's hard to know. There's so many different ways that you can sort of take your journey in coding. So it's really difficult to say, I know that after CSS, I have to learn JavaScript because you don't. You can learn Python and still do the same thing, right?
Yeah.
So having a mentor and having a peer group who can just give you that feedback of somebody who's just a little bit ahead of you too, right? I heard this a while ago. Like if you want to learn to play hockey, right? You don't find Wayne Gretzky, who's the best hockey player of all time, and ask him to be your mentor. You find somebody who's just a little bit further ahead of you, right? Because Wayne Gretzky already understands so much complexity about like how hockey works that it would be actually very difficult for him to be a mentor for you or to teach you because he's not thinking about how to lace up my shoes, right? He's done that a million times in his life. But the person who's just a little bit ahead of you will say, this is how you lace your shoes. This is how you step onto the ice. And those are important things when you're a beginner to get that foundation. And that's why we can be so helpful for you guys because it's not like we've been in the industry for 20 years, but we are just ahead of you where, if you're a beginner and you want to really understand what you need to know to be successful in this industry and learn what you need to know to get a job, we can be that for you. And the people in this group can be that for you too, right? Because they're able to say, hey, I just learned JavaScript the other day and this is what tripped me up. Is that tripping you up? Instead of somebody who's like, yeah, I do JavaScript every day for the last 20 years. They don't even think about semicolons anymore or whatever it is, right? Like that stuff's easy for them,
Yeah.
but they can't relate to you. So that's my point.
I just want to respond. There's a couple of comments. Eric asked that he's working on React Next and dabbling in TypeScript. So if you were referencing books, I would say, like we talked about this the other day, Next.js is really new.
Yeah.
I would just use their documentation is really good. Stick with that because there really isn't a lot of stuff out there right now because they just updated it literally in October.
Yeah.
React, there's some good stuff like Learn React is quite good. TypeScript, it's pretty easy. I mean, like once you get familiar with React, you pretty much are learning TypeScript. It's not that bad. But I would say like there's some really good books like Learn React is very good. I think there's also like a React it's like cookbook I think out there. I think O'Reilly makes one that's pretty decent.
Mhm.
Um And then Chris was also asking how important is learning like dev tools. And I actually
Yeah.
think dev tools, you'd be surprised, are like really important to know and understand, because not only just like in learning, like it's important for also like debugging. Like if you're doing a React project and you use like the debugger thing in it, it'll stop your code and tell you what's going on, but you need dev tools to see that. Or to give you a more concrete example, like I was just been finishing a project for a client, and one of the things I had to do was, it was a Django Python project. So I was using dev tools to make sure that, like, when I was setting in my forms like certain classes and stuff for the little elements in the HTML, I was making sure that was coming up. And then I was using that to then look at the dev tool to then see like that all the IDs are right and everything, and then make my JavaScript to manipulate that from the client side. So it's
Yeah.
important to know how to navigate that, to actually like be able to like find stuff quickly in your project, to, debug, and also just to learn. Sometimes I look at other websites too that I think are interesting, and you can look at how they're doing stuff through dev tools, and that can be a useful way to kind of figure it out yourself.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that learning dev tools is very important, with particularly debugging, but also just during development, like you were saying, because when you start working with APIs and databases, you're going to be passing information back and forth sort of behind the scenes in your web app. And you can use the console in uh, like the dev tools in order to see that data in like JSON form and be able to like sort of pull out the pieces that you want. And that's super helpful. Also, when you're building React projects, you can see all of your components and all of your like states in your components in there. And then also there's like the network tab, which shows you what's going on with like, between you and the server that you're interacting
Oh, there's
with. And
also
that's super important to know too, because you could be like super frustrated about something on your front
yeah.
end, and it could just be like the server is just rejecting your call or something like that. So,
I
um,
didn't see. He also asked if there's a difference between Edge, Chrome, and stuff. There's really not. I mean, the dev
yeah.
tools all offer pretty much the same thing. You can also get, like, I know with React, there's a specific extension you can get to add specific dev tools for React to your browser. So
Mhm.
look at the extensions as well, because that can be really helpful too, to add
Yeah.
functionality.
Yeah. And I was going to say also, if you're learning, yeah, it's just React Developer Tools is the extension that Danny was talking about. And that will show you all of your components, all the use state, all that stuff, right in
Yeah.
your inspector. Um, the other thing I would recommend, like again, you're talking about books, but I prefer videos. So one of the YouTube channels that I watch a lot is JavaScript Mastery, because he does a lot of real projects, like full stack projects that are he's basically building from scratch. And a lot of times they're way over my head, which is okay. Not now, but like when I was learning, a lot of it was way over my head, but it actually helped me learn so much faster, because you just work through it and then you figure out how it works after the fact. And just the muscle memory of putting the code down, and actually typing it. Don't just watch it. I think that's one of the worst
Yeah.
things you actually can do if you're trying to learn as a developer, is to just watch a YouTube tutorial. That's not helpful at all. You
No.
have to actually code it. Even if you don't understand what you're writing, just write it and then go back and figure out why that worked that way. Go ahead,
And
Danny.
expect that it's going to take way longer than the video is to write it out. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
if it's like, if you're doing like a 5 hour video and you're going to write everything out, expect to spend like a week on it, because that's really
yeah.
how long it's going to take. Like, if you're not like,
And that's
doing that.
totally
Yeah.
normal and okay, because when I first started watching those, it took me a week to do it. And now I can code that same project in less time than probably the video would take. It's just muscle
Yeah.
memory, right? It's like I have pretty much all of Tailwind memorized now. So you show me a visual and I can like make it before, I can generate like whatever component you're trying to make visually in my head before I even start typing it out. And that took me a long time to get to. And it's just practice. So you got
Yeah.
to, like, you actually got to type it out. So, um, yeah. So, any other closing thoughts you guys have? We're about a half hour in, and I think that should be super helpful. If anyone has any last minute questions, throw them in the comments. And yeah, awesome. Well, thank you guys for tuning in again. We have a pretty special surprise coming for you this week. A bit more opportunity to work with us. So keep your eyes in the Facebook group. We will be launching that next week at this time. Will be like the first time that you guys will see that. And yeah, thanks again for tuning in. Eric says immediate subscribe. Awesome. I assume he's talking about JavaScript mastery, but yeah, you can subscribe here too, I guess, right? Give us a like if you enjoyed and you got some value out of today's live stream. And yeah, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We really love doing these for you and hope you're gaining something from this. Yeah. Anything else you guys want to add?
No.
Awesome. Peace, everybody. We'll see you next week, same time.
Later.